May 14, 1992 began as an ordinary Thursday in the northern suburbs of Dayton, Ohio, the kind of morning that rarely left any mark on history. In a modest two-story house near the intersection of North Main Street and a quiet residential block, the Carter family moved through their routine with the steady rhythm of working-class America in the early 1990s. Daniel Carter worked long hours as an electrical technician for a manufacturing plant outside the city. His job was stable but demanding, tied to a schedule that followed the rise and fall of factory shifts. Rebecca Carter supplemented the family income by giving piano lessons from home, building a small circle of neighborhood students who came twice a week. Their world revolved around their only child, 6-year-old Hannah Carter. Hannah was in first grade at Fairview Elementary, less than a mile from their house. The route to school was familiar and short, running along a residential street where neighbors recognized one another by sight. For years, families in that neighborhood had trusted those sidewalks and side streets. It was the kind of place where parents believed independence was part of growing up. Letting a child walk or ride alone to school was not unusual. It was considered a small but important step toward confidence. That Thursday morning carried no warning. Hannah left home shortly before 8 o'clock, wearing a small backpack with her name stitched inside the lining. The school day was expected to end at 3. Nothing about the morning suggested interruption. No unusual calls. No reported disturbances. No strangers ringing doorbells. Dayton moved through its usual weekday rhythm while factories opened, traffic thickened on Interstate 75, and classrooms filled with children reciting spelling words and multiplication tables. By mid-morning, Rebecca was focused on lesson plans and household errands. Noon approached quietly. Then the first fracture appeared. Fairview Elementary contacted the Carter residence just after 11:45 a.m. Hannah had not been marked present in her classroom. The assumption at first was simple miscommunication. Perhaps she had arrived late. Perhaps she was in the nurse's office. Within minutes, confirmation came that Hannah had never checked in. No teacher had seen her that day. Rebecca contacted Daniel at work. Calls to neighbors followed. No one had seen Hannah after she left the house. A search along the route to school began almost immediately. Within a short time, a patrol car from the Dayton Police Department arrived in the neighborhood. The discovery was made less than a quarter mile from the Carter home. Hannah's blue bicycle was found resting near the edge of the road. Her backpack lay nearby. The contents were intact: homework folder, lunchbox, a small paperback library book. There were no visible signs of violence. No scattered belongings beyond what had been found. The arrangement did not resemble a child who had simply dropped her things and wandered off. Investigators documented tire impressions pressed into damp soil near the roadway. The pattern suggested a pickup truck. The tracks angled away from the street and disappeared where pavement began. No immediate witnesses stepped forward with definitive information. The neighborhood, once defined by familiarity, suddenly felt uncertain. By late afternoon, the case was officially classified as a suspected abduction. Daniel and Rebecca Carter were interviewed separately at the Dayton Police Headquarters. Standard procedure required timelines, recent contacts, family dynamics, financial history, and background checks. In the first hours of a missing child case, no assumption could be excluded. Every possibility was weighed. Word spread quickly across Dayton. Local news stations interrupted programming with breaking reports about a missing 6-year-old girl. A school photograph of Hannah, taken just months earlier, was broadcast repeatedly. Her name began appearing on scrolling tickers beneath evening headlines. Police canvassed the area for anyone who might have noticed a vehicle matching the tire impressions. One resident reported seeing a gray pickup truck idling near a corner close to the school route earlier that morning. The description was incomplete, but it provided direction. Within days, investigators identified a person of interest: Marcus Doyle, 31 years old, a mechanic who had previously serviced the Carter family's vehicle. Doyle lived alone and had occasional contact with neighborhood residents. Employment records indicated he had left his workplace earlier than scheduled on the morning Hannah disappeared. He stated he returned home due to fatigue from an overnight shift. When officers examined his gray pickup truck, The engine showed signs of recent use. Soil samples were collected from the tires for comparison with impressions found near the bicycle. The match was inconclusive, neither eliminating nor confirming involvement. Under mounting public attention, Doyle denied wrongdoing. No physical evidence placed Hannah inside his vehicle. No witness confirmed seeing her enter a truck. Without probable cause, law enforcement could not make an arrest. The investigation expanded beyond Dayton within the first week. State authorities issued alerts across Ohio and neighboring states. Volunteers assisted in organized searches. The Carter family's quiet suburban street transformed into the center of a regional crisis. Yet for all the urgency, answers remained absent. As the sun set on the first week after May 14, 1992, the case stood suspended between suspicion and uncertainty. A 6-year-old girl had vanished during a routine walk to school. A bicycle and a set of tire tracks were the only tangible markers left behind. In the Carter home, silence replaced the ordinary sounds of daily life. In the police files, Hannah Carter became more than a name. She became an open case number assigned to a disappearance that would resist resolution for years to come. The first full week after May 14, 1992 did not bring clarity. It brought momentum. By the second day, the Dayton Police Department had formally identified Marcus Doyle as their primary person of interest. The reasoning was practical, not dramatic. Doyle owned a gray pickup truck similar to the one reported near Hannah's route. He had known the Carter family through routine car repairs. He had no spouse, no children, and few documented personal connections. He had also left work earlier than scheduled on the morning of the disappearance. Investigators reconstructed his timeline minute by minute. Doyle had clocked out of his overnight shift at 6:18 a.m., citing fatigue. His supervisor confirmed the departure. Doyle stated he drove straight home and slept until late morning. No neighbor could verify his arrival time. No one had seen him leave again. The engine of his truck had still retained residual warmth when officers inspected it mid-afternoon on May 14th. Doyle explained that he had taken a short drive earlier in the morning before resting. The statement aligned with the physical evidence but did not explain where he had gone or why. Soil from the truck's tires was collected and compared with samples taken from the location where Hannah's bicycle had been found. The results came back inconclusive. The composition was similar to much of the region's soil. No unique trace elements were identified that could directly tie the truck to the scene. Investigators obtained a search warrant for Doyle's residence. The small rental property yielded no physical evidence connected to Hannah. No clothing, no backpack items, no fibers, no biological traces. Nothing that could elevate suspicion to charge. Public attention intensified as Doyle's name leaked to local media. Evening broadcasts began referring to him as the mechanic under investigation. Reporters positioned themselves outside the police station and outside Doyle's residence. Neighbors were interviewed. Former co-workers were asked to comment on his demeanor. Under pressure, law enforcement maintained that Doyle was a person of interest, not an arrested suspect. That distinction mattered legally, but in the court of public opinion, it dissolved quickly. Meanwhile, the search expanded beyond Dayton city limits. The Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation joined the effort. Alerts were distributed across state lines to Kentucky and Indiana. Highway patrol officers were briefed on the vehicle description. Missing child bulletins were faxed to law enforcement agencies throughout the Midwest. Search grids were established covering wooded parcels, drainage areas, abandoned properties, and industrial lots within a 5-mile radius. Volunteers organized through churches and civic groups participated in structured sweeps. The operations followed protocol. Assigned zones, documentation, and supervision by law enforcement. Nothing was found. As days passed, investigators reviewed every known contact in Hannah's life. Teachers, school staff, family friends, relatives in neighboring counties, delivery drivers, and registered offenders within a 50-mile radius were interviewed. Background checks were performed on extended family members. Financial records of the Carter household were reviewed. Standard investigative procedure required elimination of all possibilities, even those uncomfortable for the family. Rebecca Carter cooperated fully. Daniel Carter complied with repeated interviews. Their phone records revealed no suspicious calls. No financial stressors indicated motive for staging a disappearance. Polygraph examinations were administered and passed. The focus returned to external involvement. Within a week, the department received an envelope postmarked from Jacksonville, Florida. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a short handwritten message stating that the child was safe and that further searching was unnecessary. No signature, no demand, no explanation. The handwriting was neat and deliberate. Analysts examined slant, spacing, and pressure patterns. The letter was processed for fingerprints. None were recoverable. The envelope had been handled in a way that left no usable trace. Investigators could not determine whether the letter was genuine, a cruel hoax, or an attempt to redirect attention. Its timing, arriving after media coverage had reached beyond Ohio, suggested the sender was aware of the case's publicity. The letter altered the investigation's trajectory. If the child was alive, urgency intensified. If the letter was deception, then it represented calculated interference. Attention shifted toward possible interstate transport. Records of recent vehicle registrations, toll booth logs, and fuel purchases connected to Doyle were requested. No immediate documentation placed him outside Ohio within the first week after the disappearance. However, employment records showed Doyle resigned from his position in Dayton 3 weeks later, citing personal reasons. By mid-June 1992, he had vacated his rental property. Forwarding information indicated relocation to Tampa, Florida. That development deepened suspicion but did not constitute proof of wrongdoing. Interviews with Doyle conducted before his departure revealed no confession, no incriminating inconsistencies beyond timeline gaps. Without physical evidence linking him to Hannah, prosecutors declined to file charges. The search operation scaled back by the end of June. Organized volunteer efforts diminished. Law enforcement resources returned gradually to routine operations, though the case remained open. For the Carter family, the pace of official activity felt disconnected from the reality of their loss. Public vigils were held in community centers. Prayer services filled church halls. Flyers bearing Hannah's photograph appeared on storefront windows across Dayton and neighboring counties. National missing children organizations began circulating her information. The case was entered into the National Crime Information Center database. The file grew thicker with each documented interview, each lab result, each report. But by late summer 1992, momentum slowed. No ransom demands surfaced. No confirmed sightings were verified. The anonymous letter remained the only suggestion that Hannah might still be alive. Marcus Doyle settled in Florida and secured employment at a local auto repair shop. Background checks conducted by Ohio authorities did not reveal criminal history. Florida officials were notified of his status as a person of interest but had no jurisdiction to detain him absent evidence. As autumn approached, the Dayton Police Department faced the reality that the investigation had reached a standstill. Surveillance of Doyle continued intermittently, but without new developments. Hannah Carter's disappearance had evolved from an emergency response into a prolonged inquiry defined by absence. The bicycle and the tire tracks remained the last confirmed markers of her presence in Ohio. The case file remained active, but for the first time since May 14th, forward motion had slowed to a near halt. By the fall of 1992, Hannah Carter's disappearance had shifted from an urgent emergency to a sustained public crisis. The initial shock that gripped Dayton hardened into something heavier. Suspicion, speculation, and division. Local television stations continued running Hannah's photograph during evening broadcasts. Community bulletin boards displayed faded flyers bearing her name. Radio call-in programs devoted segments to theories about what had happened. Some callers insisted Marcus Doyle had taken her across state lines. Others questioned whether the investigation had overlooked something inside the Carter household. The Dayton Police Department maintained that the case remained active, yet internally momentum was slipping. Every lead generated through tip lines required documentation and follow-up. Hundreds of calls came in during the first 3 months, most of them unverifiable. Reported sightings stretched from Cincinnati to Toledo, from Indiana to rural Kentucky. Each one required coordination with local agencies. None were confirmed. Public pressure intensified as national outlets picked up the story. Cable news programs featured Hannah's disappearance as part of broader discussions about child safety in suburban America. Experts debated stranger abduction statistics. Commentators questioned whether small-town law enforcement had sufficient resources for complex investigations. Within the department, frustration grew. Officers had interviewed dozens of individuals connected indirectly to Marcus Doyle. Former co-workers described him as quiet, competent, and socially isolated. Neighbors in Dayton characterized him as reserved but not threatening. There were no documented prior accusations of misconduct involving children. Still, the timeline surrounding May 14th refused to settle cleanly. Doyle's early departure from work, the warmth of his truck engine, his relocation to Florida weeks later. All of it pointed toward suspicion without crossing the threshold into chargeable evidence. Meanwhile, Rebecca Carter began writing formal requests to the Dayton police chief and to the Ohio Attorney General's office, asking for outside review. Daniel Carter contacted national missing children organizations for additional exposure. The case file expanded with correspondence, media clippings, and memoranda summarizing every development. The anonymous letter remained a central complication. Postmarked from Jacksonville, Florida, it introduced the possibility that Hannah had been transported south almost immediately. Investigators reached out to Florida authorities, requesting cooperation in reviewing vehicle registrations, adoption records, and known associates of Marcus Doyle. The response was procedural but limited. Without a warrant supported by probable cause, deeper investigation into private records was not authorized. By early 1993, Dayton police re-interviewed Doyle in coordination with Florida law enforcement. He denied sending the letter. Handwriting comparisons conducted at the time could not definitively link him to the note. There were similarities in slant and letter formation, but the analysis did not meet evidentiary standards for prosecution. The investigation team reviewed Hannah's school records and teacher interviews once more. No indication surfaced that she had expressed fear of a particular individual. Her academic file described her as attentive, social, and well-adjusted. No behavioral red flags were noted prior to May 14th. As winter passed into spring 1993, volunteer searches ceased entirely. The official search radius remained documented, but organized sweeps ended. Law enforcement shifted into periodic review mode, revisiting the file at intervals while focusing on new cases. Public perception evolved. In the absence of resolution, narratives formed. Some residents began to view the Carter family with unease, questioning why no ransom demand had been made if the case involved kidnapping for profit. Others directed anger toward law enforcement, accusing the department of incompetence. Marcus Doyle's move to Florida in mid-1992 became a focal point in media discussions. Reporters traveled to Tampa, attempting to interview him at his workplace. Doyle declined public comment. His employer described him as reliable and technically skilled. No evidence placed a child in his custody. By late 1993, the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation conducted a formal audit of the case file. The audit concluded that procedures had been followed correctly given available technology and resources. Recommendations included preserving all physical evidence and maintaining the case in the National Missing Persons Database. The anonymous letter's role continued to trouble investigators. Analysts revisited its phrasing. The child is safe. Stop looking. The absence of a demand suggested motive beyond financial gain. It implied either personal involvement or malicious interference. Yet the letter's origin could not be conclusively traced to any specific individual. As years passed, the case settled into what law enforcement refers to as active but suspended. Periodic checks were conducted on Marcus Doyle's criminal record. No arrests, no charges, no incidents. He remained employed in Florida through the mid-1990s. Rebecca Carter's letters became an annual ritual. Each May 14th, she sent a written request for review. Daniel Carter attended conferences on missing children, advocating for stronger interstate coordination and improved record sharing. Their persistence ensured the file was never fully closed. Still, by the end of the 1990s, the investigation had effectively stalled. No DNA evidence had been recovered in 1992. The tire impressions documented near the bicycle were insufficient for modern analysis. No preserved biological material from the scene offered a path forward. Hannah Carter's name remained in the National Crime Information Center database. Her age was periodically updated in projections showing what she might look like at 16, then 18, then 21. In the absence of new evidence, the Dayton Police Department officially reclassified the case in 2001 as a cold case. The designation did not signal abandonment. It acknowledged reality. The investigation had exhausted every viable lead available within the limits of early 1990s forensic capability. Marcus Doyle continued his life in Florida. The anonymous letter remained archived in an evidence envelope, its origin unresolved. Hannah Carter's disappearance became part of Ohio's unsolved case registry, one of many files stored in metal cabinets and digital databases, waiting for technology or circumstance to provide what time had withheld. Through the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, Hannah Carter's disappearance settled into the quiet permanence of an unresolved file. The Dayton Police Department retained custody of the physical evidence collected in May 1992, but there was little left to examine. The bicycle, the backpack, the soil samples, and the envelope containing the anonymous letter were cataloged and stored according to departmental standards at the time. Advances in forensic science were beginning to reshape criminal investigations nationwide, but the Carter case lacked one essential element: preserved biological material that could yield DNA. Rebecca Carter continued her annual letters every May. Each one requested review, each one asked whether new technology might offer fresh hope. Standard responses acknowledged her persistence and assured her that the case remained open. Daniel Carter withdrew gradually from public advocacy, though he never disengaged from the process entirely. The family relocated permanently to Columbus in 1998, seeking distance from the public scrutiny that had defined their life in Dayton. In Florida, Marcus Doyle remained under intermittent review. Ohio authorities conducted background checks at intervals to determine whether any criminal activity might trigger renewed inquiry. None surfaced. He maintained employment in Tampa's automotive repair industry, filed taxes regularly, and avoided media contact. His name remained in the Carter file as the primary suspect, but without evidence, it carried no legal consequence. In 2004, a development occurred that initially seemed peripheral. Marcus Doyle died in a single-vehicle accident outside Tampa. Florida Highway Patrol recorded the cause as mechanical failure leading to loss of control. Toxicology reports showed no impairment. The incident was processed as routine. Ohio authorities were notified of Doyle's death due to his status in the cold case file. Detectives in Dayton reviewed the development carefully. With Doyle deceased, the possibility of prosecution, if evidence ever surfaced, became impossible. Still, investigators requested access to any personal property retained by Florida law enforcement following the accident. The request yielded limited documentation: a personal effects inventory listing a wallet, keys, a metal lighter, and miscellaneous papers. No direct references to Hannah Carter were identified in the materials shared at that time. The Carter file remained technically active but functionally dormant. By the mid-2000s, national attention had shifted toward the emerging use of DNA databases in cold cases. High-profile exonerations and delayed identifications demonstrated the power of preserved biological evidence. Ohio established a formal cold case review unit in 2008, tasked with auditing unresolved cases for potential forensic reexamination. Hannah Carter's file was flagged for review in 2009. Analysts assessed the viability of stored materials. The soil samples taken from the scene in 1992 had degraded. The tire impressions were documented only in photographs taken with film technology of that era. The bicycle and backpack yielded no preserved biological trace suitable for modern sequencing. The anonymous letter was retested for latent DNA, but prior handling had compromised any potential recovery. The audit concluded that while procedural standards in 1992 had been consistent with practices of the time. Insufficient biological evidence existed to support DNA comparison. Rebecca Carter received notice that the case had been formally categorized as a long-term cold case under Ohio's updated registry. The classification did not signify closure. It reflected administrative structure. In 2011, the Dayton Police Department digitized archival case materials, transferring physical records into a centralized database accessible to the Cold Case Review Unit. The digitization included scanned reports, interview transcripts, laboratory summaries, and photographic documentation of the tire impressions and bicycle location. Analysts hoped that digital enhancement might clarify previously indistinct details. Image specialists attempted to enhance the tire impression photographs using contemporary software. While the tread pattern remained consistent with light-duty pickup trucks common in the early 1990s, the resolution was insufficient to isolate unique wear patterns. The enhancement did not produce actionable evidence. In 2013, Rebecca Carter participated in a statewide awareness campaign marking National Missing Children's Day. Hannah's age progressed image, generated using updated modeling software, was released publicly. The image projected how she might appear at 21. The release generated brief media coverage but no credible leads. The case continued its pattern of periodic review and extended silence. Internal memoranda from 2014 through 2018 documented routine checks of interstate databases, including adoption registries and unidentified persons files. No match surfaced. Florida authorities were contacted twice during this period to verify whether any unidentified remains or unaccounted juvenile records aligned with Hannah's age. Each inquiry returned negative. The anonymous letter remained an unresolved variable. Handwriting analysis conducted in 1992 had been limited by technology. In 2016, the document was reanalyzed using updated comparative software. Marcus Doyle's known signatures, preserved in employment and licensing records, were reviewed again. The results showed similarities but fell short of forensic certainty. The letter could not be conclusively attributed to him. By 2018, the Cold Case Review Unit faced resource limitations common to state agencies. Cases were prioritized based on the presence of preserved biological evidence. Hannah Carter's file, lacking such evidence, ranked lower in reexamination priority. Then, in early 2019, administrative changes altered that trajectory. The Ohio Attorney General's office authorized funding for a pilot program involving advanced ground-penetrating radar and localized forensic resurvey of historic abduction sites. The objective was to determine whether overlooked physical traces might remain beneath undisturbed soil layers. Hannah Carter's disappearance site in Dayton was selected as one of several pilot locations due to its relatively contained search radius and preserved municipal property boundaries. For the first time since 1992, investigators prepared to return physically to the area where the bicycle had been found. The decision did not arise from new witness testimony or recovered documents. It stemmed from technological possibility. The Cold Case Review Unit documented the rationale in a formal proposal. Advancements in subsurface imaging and trace recovery could reveal biological remnants previously undetectable. The Carter file, dormant for nearly 3 decades, was reopened for active field review in the spring of 2019. In the spring of 2019, the Cold Case Review Unit returned to the original location documented in the 1992 reports. The decision had not come from a new witness or confession. It had come from technological advancement and administrative approval. The pilot program authorized limited field resurvey of historic abduction sites using ground-penetrating radar and precision grid mapping. Hannah Carter's case qualified because the original recovery area had never been fully excavated beyond surface inspection. The site had changed over the decades. Infrastructure improvements and routine development had altered the surrounding streets. However, municipal planning records confirmed that a narrow strip of land adjacent to the roadway where Hannah's bicycle had been found remained largely undisturbed beneath the surface. That technical distinction mattered. Investigators reconstructed the 1992 scene using archived diagrams and digitized photographs. Coordinates were translated into modern GPS mapping systems. The survey team divided the targeted area into measured grid sections, logging each square for systematic scanning. The radar equipment produced layered subsurface images. Most anomalies registered as typical soil disturbances, root systems, or residual debris common in suburban environments. Data analysts filtered out known non-biological signatures. The process was deliberate and repetitive. In the third week of the survey, a small but distinct anomaly appeared approximately 12 feet from the documented location of the bicycle recovery. The signal indicated a compact object approximately 30 centimeters below the surface. The density differed from surrounding soil. Excavation proceeded manually to preserve integrity. The object recovered was not immediately identifiable as significant. It resembled a small fragment of keratinized material, roughly half a centimeter in length. Field technicians noted its pale coloration and intact structure. The fragment was sealed under chain of custody protocol and transported to the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation Forensic Laboratory in Columbus. Initial examination under microscopy confirmed the material as human fingernail. Despite its age, the keratin layers appeared partially preserved. Advances in degraded DNA recovery techniques, particularly protocols developed for archaeological samples, made extraction possible. Laboratory technicians initiated a careful decontamination and sequencing process. The sample was assigned an internal evidence designation and processed using advanced amplification methods designed for low-template DNA. Within days, a viable genetic profile was obtained. The profile was entered into Ohio's missing persons database, which still retained a reference sample voluntarily submitted by Rebecca Carter in 1993 at the recommendation of federal advisors. The original sample had been preserved digitally in subsequent database updates. The comparison returned a high-probability maternal match. The lab director requested independent verification. A second extraction confirmed the sequence. Statistical analysis concluded that the fingernail fragment belonged to a biological child of Rebecca Carter, with a confidence level exceeding 99.9%. The finding altered the status of the case immediately. The fragment's stratigraphic placement indicated that it had not been recently deposited. Geological analysis showed the soil layer above it had remained undisturbed since the early 1990s. The implication was direct. The fragment originated from the time frame of Hannah's disappearance. The DNA profile was then uploaded to the Combined DNA Index System and cross-referenced against federal and commercial genealogy databases authorized for investigative use. The initial objective was not suspect identification. It was victim identification confirmation beyond doubt. Weeks passed as national database comparisons ran through millions of profiles. The process required coordination with federal authorities due to interstate implications. In March 2021, the system flagged a significant match. A civilian DNA profile submitted through a consumer ancestry service by a Florida resident named Olivia Brooks demonstrated a near-perfect parent-child genetic correlation with the fingernail sample. The probability of unrelated coincidence was calculated at less than 0.02%. Olivia Brooks had been born in May 1992 according to official Florida records. Adoption documentation indicated she had been placed with adoptive parents in Jacksonville in 1994. Her birth certificate listed a mother named Linda Harper and no father identified. Further inquiry revealed the certificate had been filed in 1994, 2 years after the recorded birth date. Florida Vital Statistics confirmed irregular timing in the registration. Hospital records corresponding to the claimed birth date did not list a delivery under Linda Harper's name. The Ohio Attorney General's office notified the Federal Bureau of Investigation due to the interstate scope and potential falsification of identity documents. A federal warrant authorized discrete collection of a direct DNA sample from Olivia Brooks for confirmation. The sample was processed independently at the FBI laboratory in Quantico. The results were conclusive. Olivia Brooks and the biological child of Rebecca Carter were genetically identical. The identity of Hannah Carter had been located nearly 29 years after her disappearance. Simultaneously, investigators reopened the file concerning Marcus Doyle's relocation to Florida in 1992. Archived employment and vehicle registration records were retrieved from Tampa and surrounding counties. Documentation confirmed Doyle's presence in Florida within weeks of Hannah's disappearance. Additional review of historical records identified Linda Harper as a distant relative of Doyle, who had briefly resided in Ohio before relocating south during the same period. The anonymous letter postmarked from Jacksonville in 1992 was re-examined in light of the new information. The Cold Case Review Unit updated the internal file designation from Unresolved Missing Child to Active Recovery Investigation. Federal authorities initiated formal coordination between Ohio and Florida law enforcement agencies. Rebecca Carter was notified that significant progress had been made. Confirmation of the genetic findings required structured protocol before any direct contact with Olivia Brooks could occur. For the first time since May 14, 1992, the Carter case shifted from absence toward measurable evidence. The fingernail fragment, once a nearly invisible remnant beneath soil, had reopened a file that had stood dormant for nearly 3 decades. Once the FBI laboratory in Quantico confirmed that Olivia Brooks and Hannah Carter were the same individual, the investigation entered a new and far more complex phase. For nearly 3 decades, the Carter case had centered on absence. Now it centered on identity. Federal agents coordinated with the Ohio Attorney General's office and Florida law enforcement to review Olivia Brooks's legal records in full. Her birth certificate, filed in 1994, listed Linda Harper as the biological mother. No father was named. The document had been registered 2 years after the stated date of birth, an irregularity that under modern standards would trigger immediate review but had not prompted scrutiny in the early 1990s. Investigators requested archived employment and residency records connected to Linda Harper. Historical data confirmed that Harper had lived briefly in Dayton in 1992 and had documented familial ties to Marcus Doyle. She had relocated to Florida within months of Hannah's disappearance. Financial records showed limited but consistent employment in administrative roles, including temporary clerical work and part-time retail positions. No criminal record was documented under her legal name in either state. The adoption file for Olivia Brooks was obtained from Duval County Family Court. The adoption had been finalized in August 1994. The petition listed Linda Harper as temporary guardian, transferring custody to a married couple residing in Jacksonville who had no prior children. The court record indicated that the adoption had been processed as lawful, supported by the birth certificate submitted by Harper. At the time, interstate verification systems between Ohio and Florida were minimal, and no cross-state alert linked the identity of a missing Ohio child to a Florida birth filing. The federal review team reconstructed a timeline. Hannah Carter disappeared on May 14, 1992. Within weeks, Marcus Doyle resigned from his job in Dayton and vacated his residence. Vehicle registration data placed him in Tampa, Florida, by June 1992. Linda Harper's relocation to Florida occurred within the same period. The anonymous letter postmarked from Jacksonville in late May 1992 now appeared consistent with Harper's geographic presence. Further document analysis revealed that Harper had withdrawn significant funds from her Florida bank account in mid-1994, 1 week prior to the adoption finalization. Shortly thereafter, she disappeared from formal records. Social Security activity under her name ceased in the late 1990s. A later federal records search indicated that she had died in Texas in 2003 under a slightly altered surname. Confirmation required cross-referencing Social Security and death certificate databases. Meanwhile, Marcus Doyle's 2004 death was re-examined in light of the DNA findings. Florida Highway Patrol reports confirmed no evidence of foul play in the accident. However, investigators requested access to any retained personal property that might not have been fully reviewed at the time. A search of archived storage in Tampa uncovered a metal container previously returned to the property owner after Doyle's death. Inside were miscellaneous personal papers, mechanical notebooks, and several photographs. One photograph, dated by film processing marks to 1993, depicted a young child approximately 1 year old in a Florida setting. The child's facial features bore strong resemblance to Hannah's 1992 school photograph when adjusted for age progression. The FBI's facial recognition unit conducted comparative analysis between the archived image and Hannah's school records. The match probability exceeded 85%, a significant correlation given the age difference and photographic quality. In addition to the photograph, A fuel receipt dated June 1992 from a service station along Interstate 75 in Georgia was recovered from Doyle's archive documents. The timestamp aligned with the estimated travel window between Ohio and Florida. Investigators also located motel records from southern Georgia listing a registration under Doyle's name in late May 1992. Each piece reinforced the developing narrative. The federal investigative summary drafted in mid-2021 concluded that Marcus Doyle had transported Hannah Carter across state lines within weeks of her disappearance. Linda Harper had assisted in falsifying identity documentation and facilitating the adoption. No evidence indicated financial ransom motive. The working theory centered on a personal fixation and misguided belief that the child required removal from her home environment. With suspects deceased, prosecution was not possible. The focus shifted to confirmation and reunification. Before direct contact with Olivia Brooks could occur, federal protocol required psychological preparation. The revelation that one's identity had been fabricated for nearly 3 decades carried potential trauma implications. FBI victim specialists and licensed clinical psychologists were assigned to coordinate the disclosure. Olivia Brooks, now 29 years old and employed as an elementary school teacher in Jacksonville, was contacted under controlled circumstances. She was informed that federal authorities needed to discuss documentation irregularities in her birth record. The conversation proceeded gradually, supported by genetic evidence presented in stages. Initial reaction involved disbelief. Olivia's legal parents had raised her since infancy. They had believed the adoption lawful. Interviews with the adoptive parents confirmed they had been told the biological mother was deceased and that no other relatives existed. They had never been informed of interstate involvement or prior missing person reports. After reviewing the DNA results from both Ohio and Quantico laboratories, Olivia consented to additional testing to eliminate any doubt. The second analysis confirmed a direct maternal match to Rebecca Carter and a full genetic alignment with the fingernail fragment recovered in Dayton. Federal authorities updated the case file status. Victim located alive under alternate identity. Simultaneously, Rebecca Carter was notified through structured counseling support. For nearly 29 years, her communications with law enforcement had yielded no tangible progress. Now the confirmation required careful delivery. Medical evaluation ensured she could process the information safely before formal introduction was arranged. The investigation team completed a comprehensive 60-page interim report documenting the sequence from 1992 through 2021. It detailed the original tire impression analysis, Doyle's relocation timeline, the anonymous letter, the adoption records, and the DNA confirmation. The document was forwarded to the Department of Justice for formal review. Hannah Carter's identity had been legally obscured for nearly 3 decades. Through a fragment of keratin preserved beneath soil, modern forensic science had reconstructed a path from Ohio to Florida and back to truth. The next step would not involve courtroom proceedings. It would involve restoring a name that had been absent from public record since May 14, 1992. Once federal authorities confirmed that Olivia Brooks was biologically Hannah Carter, the investigation shifted from identification to reconstruction. The question was no longer whether Hannah had survived. The question was how the sequence of events in 1992 had unfolded with such precision and silence. FBI analysts began integrating Olivia's structured psychological interviews into the investigative record. The sessions were conducted by licensed trauma specialists trained in memory retrieval without suggestion. The objective was not to extract dramatic recollection but to identify sensory fragments that might align with documented evidence. Olivia reported recurring impressions that had followed her throughout adulthood without context. She described a road bordered by tall trees, the sensation of waiting near a familiar route, and the sound profile of a truck engine idling. She could not assign these memories to a specific age, but the imagery appeared consistent and persistent. When investigators presented digitized photographs of the 1992 bicycle recovery location, she identified the general roadway alignment as familiar. The psychological team documented another recurring sensory element: the smell of motor oil and gasoline. Olivia had reported discomfort in auto repair environments during her teenage years without understanding the source. When informed that Marcus Doyle had worked as a mechanic, the connection became relevant to the investigative timeline. Under controlled review, Olivia examined the 1993 Florida photograph recovered from Doyle's stored materials. The image showed a young child approximately 1 year old. Olivia stated she recognized the white sandals and described a memory of living near coastal humidity and hearing references to Aunt Linda. Federal records confirmed that Linda Harper had resided in northern Florida through 1993. Investigators compared these recollections to the reconstructed travel timeline. Fuel receipts placed Doyle in Georgia in late May 1992. Employment records showed a lapse between his resignation in Ohio and his initial documented work in Tampa. The gap covered approximately 8 months. During that period, no official address was registered under his name, though motel records and vehicle service invoices suggested temporary lodging across southern states. The working federal conclusion identified a coordinated relocation effort. Doyle transported Hannah across state lines shortly after May 14, 1992. Harper assisted in maintaining concealment and later formalized a new identity through falsified documentation. Additional forensic analysis revisited the anonymous letter sent to Dayton police in 1992. Using updated spectral imaging and handwriting modeling software, federal examiners compared the letter to verified signatures from Linda Harper's employment and banking records. The match probability reached 97%. The slant, pressure, and distinctive letter formation corresponded closely. The letter's origin, once ambiguous, now fit the timeline. Postmark analysis confirmed it was mailed from Jacksonville during the period Harper's residency records placed her there. The purpose of the letter appeared strategic: to reduce investigative intensity and suggest voluntary relocation rather than abduction. Investigators concluded that the absence of ransom demand and the content of the letter reflected a psychological motive rather than financial intent. Doyle's employment history and interviews with former co-workers suggested isolation and personal grievance. No documented evidence indicated he believed Hannah faced physical harm at home. However, investigators theorized that Doyle had constructed a narrative in which he perceived himself as a protector. Linda Harper's role appeared facilitative. Her administrative background enabled her to navigate paperwork systems that, in the early 1990s, lacked interstate verification safeguards. The fraudulent birth certificate created a legal foundation for the 1994 adoption. Court transcripts indicated the adoptive parents had no knowledge of falsification. They underwent standard background checks and completed required documentation in good faith. Olivia's adoptive parents cooperated fully with federal investigators. They confirmed that Harper had presented herself as a guardian unable to provide long-term care for a child whose biological mother had allegedly died. The narrative had not been questioned at the time due to limited cross-state record integration. Marcus Doyle's death in 2004 eliminated the possibility of formal interrogation or prosecution. Linda Harper's confirmed death in 2003 under an altered surname in Texas similarly foreclosed criminal proceedings. The Department of Justice classified the case as resolved but non-prosecutable due to suspect mortality. The investigative summary prepared in late 2021 synthesized physical evidence, documentary records, and psychological corroboration. It concluded that Hannah Carter had been abducted on May 14, 1992 by Marcus Doyle with assistance from Linda Harper. She had been transported from Ohio to Florida within weeks and raised under the identity Olivia Brooks following a legally finalized but fraudulently supported adoption in 1994. The report further stated that no evidence indicated prolonged physical harm during transport or subsequent upbringing. However, the deprivation of identity, family connection, and lawful guardianship constituted severe psychological and legal violation. Olivia reviewed portions of the report under supervision. She confirmed that her earliest memory fragments aligned with Florida in the early 1990s and that no verified recollection preceded approximately age 3. This developmental gap corresponded with the period immediately following her abduction. In internal meetings, federal investigators characterized the case as a convergence of outdated interstate systems and modern forensic capability. The fingernail fragment recovered in 2019 served as the definitive biological anchor linking past to present. Rebecca Carter's maternal DNA sample, submitted in 1993, remained preserved through decades of database transitions. Without that preservation, confirmation would have required additional genealogical triangulation. By the end of 2021, the federal investigative narrative was complete. Hannah Carter had not vanished into permanent absence. She had lived under a different name, unaware of the original identity erased in 1992. The Carter file, once defined by unanswered questions and suspended suspicion, now contained a coherent sequence supported by genetic science, archived documentation, and corroborated memory. The next step would not involve further evidence gathering. It would involve formal restoration of identity and the first direct contact between Hannah Carter and the mother who had written letters every May for nearly 3 decades. By early 2022, nearly 30 years after May 14, 1992, the Carter case moved toward its final chapter. The file that had once contained missing person alerts, inconclusive lab reports, and unanswered letters now held verified DNA sequences, interstate documentation, and a confirmed identity restoration plan. The meeting between Rebecca Carter and the woman legally known as Olivia Brooks was scheduled for June 2022 at the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation headquarters in Columbus. The location was selected for privacy, medical support, and controlled access. Federal victim specialists and licensed counselors coordinated the timing to ensure both women were emotionally prepared. Rebecca, now in her late 60s, had spent decades marking each anniversary with unanswered questions. Olivia, 29 years old, had lived her entire life unaware that her origin story had been constructed from false paperwork. The reunion was structured according to protocol. Identity confirmation documents were reviewed and signed in the presence of state and federal representatives. Genetic charts demonstrating the maternal match were presented formally, not as spectacle but as legal record. The chain of custody from the Fingernail fragment to the Quantico laboratory report was documented and archived. When Rebecca and Hannah, no longer only Olivia, sat across from each other for the first time in 3 decades, there was no need for forensic explanation. The years of absence were undeniable, yet the DNA results had already established what both had waited to hear. The missing child from Dayton had survived. The reunion did not erase the lost years. It did not rewrite the adolescence Hannah had experienced in Florida or restore the childhood Rebecca had imagined. But it altered the trajectory of a story that had once seemed permanently suspended. In the weeks following the meeting, the Ohio Attorney General's office issued a formal statement updating the case status to victim located alive. The federal report summarized the findings. Marcus Doyle had abducted Hannah Carter in May 1992 with assistance from Linda Harper. Both individuals were deceased. The acts of interstate transport and identity falsification were confirmed but no longer prosecutable. Rebecca Carter returned to Columbus with a sense of closure she had never allowed herself to anticipate. For nearly 30 years, she had written letters to law enforcement not knowing whether her daughter was alive or deceased. The uncertainty had defined her existence. Now certainty replaced speculation. The loss remained, but it no longer existed in a void. Hannah chose to retain the name Olivia Brooks legally while acknowledging her birth name, Hannah Carter, in official records. Identity restoration required careful navigation through Social Security documentation, educational transcripts, and employment files. Federal authorities assisted in correcting historical data without invalidating her adult legal standing. The process reflected the complexity of undoing decades of administrative misrepresentation. Rebecca's health had gradually declined during the final years of uncertainty. In early 2023, she passed away from natural causes in Columbus. In her personal notebook, discovered among her belongings, the final entry was dated shortly after the reunion. It stated that the search had ended and that peace had replaced fear. The note did not mention anger. It did not mention resentment. It acknowledged only that her daughter had been found. At Rebecca's memorial service, attended by investigators from Ohio and federal representatives who had worked the reopened case, Hannah stood not as a victim but as evidence of persistence. The ceremony was private. There were no media cameras. Those present understood the weight of the journey that had unfolded from 1992 to 2022. Following her mother's death, Hannah made a decision that surprised some observers. Rather than retreat from the attention surrounding her recovery, she chose to engage with it. She partnered with Ohio's Cold Case Review Unit to speak at law enforcement training seminars. Cadets studying forensic science heard the account of how a fragment of keratin buried beneath soil for nearly 3 decades had reopened a file many assumed would remain unsolved. Hannah also collaborated with national organizations supporting families of missing children. She spoke about the psychological complexity of discovering a stolen identity. She described the experience not as a simple reunion but as a reconstruction of self. Her message emphasized preservation of evidence, of hope, of records that might seem insignificant at the time. The Carter case became a reference point in discussions about interstate database integration and adoption verification standards. Legislative reviews in both Ohio and Florida cited the administrative vulnerabilities of the early 1990s that allowed falsified documentation to pass without cross-state confirmation. While the legal system could not prosecute those responsible, it could strengthen the safeguards that might prevent repetition. Each year on May 14th, Hannah returned to Dayton. The location where her bicycle had been recovered no longer resembled the coordinates documented in the 1992 file. But the significance remained fixed in record and memory. She placed a small bouquet near the roadside marker installed quietly by local officials after the case was resolved. The Cold Case Review Unit engraved Hannah Carter's name on a recognition wall at headquarters, identifying her as one of the few long-term missing children located alive through modern forensic technology. The inscription did not glorify the crime. It acknowledged the endurance of investigation. In official archives, the file designation was updated from unresolved missing child to closed victim located alive. The closure classification did not imply satisfaction. It marked completion. The Carter case spanned 3 decades of American legal evolution. It moved from film photography and soil impressions to DNA sequencing and interstate database integration. It exposed the fragility of early administrative systems and demonstrated the corrective power of scientific advancement. Yet beyond technology and reports, the story centered on persistence. A mother who never stopped writing letters. Investigators who returned to a forgotten strip of land. A preserved DNA sample submitted in 1993 that waited nearly 30 years for matching technology. A fragment of fingernail that refused to decay into silence. In the end, the resolution did not undo the harm inflicted in 1992. It did not restore lost birthdays or school years, but it restored truth. And truth, even delayed by decades, carried weight. The Carter case stands as a reminder that time does not always erase what matters. Evidence preserved with care can outlast assumptions. Systems can improve. Records can reconnect. And even when justice arrives too late for prosecution, it can still deliver something equally powerful. Recognition. Sometimes what families search for is not only the missing person, but the assurance that the story will not be forgotten. In a world where headlines fade quickly, the Carter file proves that persistence, science, and memory together can return what silence once tried to keep hidden. Thank you sincerely for taking the time to listen to today's story. In a world that moves quickly and forgets easily, your willingness to pause, reflect, and stay until the end truly matters. Stories like this remind us that time does not erase truth, and that even the smallest piece of evidence, hope, or persistence can change a life decades later. What we can learn from this story is simple, yet powerful. Never underestimate the value of perseverance. A mother never stopped believing. Investigators never stopped preserving records. And one tiny fragment of evidence, carefully protected, eventually brought light back into a life that had been living in silence. Justice may be delayed, but it is never meaningless. Hope may fade, but it does not disappear as long as someone continues searching. If this story moved you, if it made you think, or if it reminded you of the importance of memory, truth, and family, we invite you to support our channel. The simplest way to help is by pressing the like button, sharing your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribing to our channel. Your support allows us to continue telling meaningful stories that deserve to be heard.